Good morning, everybody, or good evening, or good night, whenever you're watching this. I hope all is well. Today we will be talking about Asian imperialism. So we've already talked about Africa, we've already talked about Latin America. Now it's time we move on to India, China, and Japan. So there's a couple of big points that we're going to hit on today. British rule in India, India growing opium, opium sold to the Chinese, China basically falls apart. And the Japanese witness this and go into their own Meiji Restoration. So let's start with India. So the British are the main and only, really, imperial powers that have control in this region. Again, this is the empire where they're referred to as the empire where the sun never sets on the British Empire. They have colonies all over the world. However, India is their most important colony, even more important than the American colonies that they formerly had. Okay, so they are still in control of India. Interestingly, instead of being directly in control of the country, they were indirectly in control. Remember, we talked about the difference between direct and indirect rule. Indirect is when you have basically someone else who's working for you, so you don't have to manage the country. So they had a British East India Trading Company, whom the government supported, and they basically ruled India. They wanted to control the trade, the resources, the people. So this company was actually super powerful. They had all the trading rights, they controlled large swaths of India, and it actually created its own army, led by British officers, but the soldiers were Indians. They were called sepoys. So we have a company that's in control of India for the British Empire. And one day these sepoys or sepoys are going to rebel against the company. So the British are going to severely punish the sepoys who refuse to load rifles. It was a religious thing. I won't get into that right now. However, the Hindus and the Muslims revolted against the British in 1857. Both sides committed horrifying atrocities. However, ultimately, the British crushed the rebellion 1 year later. This led to the government having to step in and take direct control from the East India Trading Company. So now we're going from indirect rule to direct rule. So let's pop over to China. We will be back to India later on in the year, but let us pop back to China. So we haven't been here in a bit. Last time we were, getting rid of feudalism. We were starting out with the newer empires, and China's really going to stick with its old ways. They're going to refuse to adapt to Western cultures. They're going to try to stay isolated. Historically, they had always been isolated because of barriers such as forests, mountains, etc. And they are extremely ethnocentric, meaning they believe that their culture is the best and they don't need anybody else and don't want anybody else. So they didn't want to trade with the West. They were isolationists. They wanted to stay isolated. And they had basically everything except opium. Opium was actually grown in India, so another British colony, and then transported to China to sell to the people. Okay, so this is the government selling drugs to the Chinese people. Let that sink in. The British Empire was at one point a drug dealer. Very interesting. So they basically get many of the Chinese hooked on opium, which is, again, a drug. So the drug trade is legitimized by the British government. However, we are going to see that China is going to really try to hunker down on this and ensure it stops, so the trade stops. However, opium was recreationally used in China in about the 15th century, so the 1400s. It was outlawed in 1729. The British begin smuggling the opium in, so almost 100 years later, the British are still smuggling opium in. And by 1835, about 12 million Chinese were addicted to opium. So much, it's such a bad situation that the Emperor of China actually sends a letter to Queen Victoria of England, asking her, nay, begging her to stop selling opium to their people. And so the Opium Wars break out. The emperor orders British shipments of opium to be confiscated and destroyed. In some cases, they would dump them in the river, or not the river, the water. And it's really this one raid that kind of sets off a war. So the Chinese are going to seize a British cargo of about 20,000 chests of opium. Each chest was worth around $1,000. And today, or I guess 10 years ago, it would have amounted to about $300 million worth of opium. In response to this, the British are going to send a fleet from India, and most of the opium wars are going to be fought at sea. However, the Chinese are going to be decimated by the British. Remember, they have steam-powered gunboats, so they are superior in their technological advances and abilities. So, India is now subjugated. China is now subjugated. And they're going to solidify their influence over China with the Treaty of Nanjing. So it was a very unfair treaty. The Chinese had to pay reparations to the British. All Chinese ports were open to the British, and British controlled Hong Kong. This would be returned to China in 1997. And the British basically made themselves immune to any of the Chinese laws. So this was a very unfair treaty. And other European nations see this, and they start taking advantage of this. They start getting their own trade deals and start dominating China. China is now at a major disadvantage. They're subjugated, they're falling behind industrially, and they are being taken advantage of. So we saw China start out as this very strong power, and now it's very weak and really doesn't have much power. We'll come back to China in a bit, but just know at this point things are really bad. So, meanwhile, the Japanese are noticing this. They're watching the Opium Wars happen. They're watching the Chinese become servants to the foreigners. Sovereignty may belong to China, but in fact, it's no more than a colony of Great Britain and France. So, the Japanese are going to get nervous because of this. And they're going to start changing. This is called the Meiji Restoration. They're going to start changing their society and their culture and their country so that they can be ready to deal with the Europeans. The Japanese are going to overthrow the final shogun and put the emperor in charge. So Japan ends its policy of isolationism, and the Meiji government is going to start to modernize. Look at the women at the bottom. Look at the men at the bottom. They're all wearing very Western clothing. They're not wearing the traditional kimonos or the robes or anything like that. Now we have dresses and we have military uniforms that are very much Westernized. But the biggest reforms that were enacted were the abolition of the feudal system, land redistribution, a written constitution. They build a modern navy, they modernize their army, and they Westernize their schools. So they're basically taking a page out of the West's book. They're redoing everything to kind of align with what the West is doing. Again, look at the royal family's clothing. It's very Western. And once they have this restoration, so remember the restoration is important, once they have this period of restoration, they are going to start to become an imperial power. They will go to war with Russia and beat Russia so badly that the entire world is forced to recognize Japan's power. Let me repeat that. Japan defeated Russia. This is the first time in history, well, in more contemporary history, that an Asian nation was able to defeat a European nation. Russia was embarrassed. We'll see this more when we get back to the Russian Revolution. But Japan is now recognized as a world power. Japan's also going to take over large portions of Korea. And what this is really going to do is set the Japanese up for success. They're making a lot of money, they're modernized, they're industrialized, and now they're a force to be reckoned with. So Japan is really ending in a great spot. They are the imperialists. They're not being dominated or subjugated. All right, so I hope everybody enjoyed this video. Please make sure you're taking notes, making your comments and questions, and I will see you soon.